Do you have any tips for kingdom creation? Must-haves versus things to not bother fleshing out unless you have a lot of time, making them be interesting and standing out. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer for kingdom creation. My rule of thumb for kingdoms is to create lore and NPCs that I'm actively going to use in the upcoming campaign. And I'll admit, part of that is because I've been DMing for so long. But really, I think the only must-have for a kingdom is a starting town. Everything else is technically optional because you don't know what you're gonna need. What I usually like to have though is the starting town, a capital, an understanding of how the government structure works. Is it a republic? Is it a monarchy? A dictatorship? Perhaps a little bit of religion in there. You have clerics and paladins running around the world, so what does this kingdom's religious structure look like? I also think having a rudimentary history of the kingdom works well, just so that you can reference things that happened in the past, and that can help inform culture. If you're wanting to go beyond the basics of kingdom creation though, I would recommend only focusing on 2 or 3 categories within a kingdom. Then for each of those categories going really in depth with your creation and your world building, so that finally, when the campaign starts, you can put these aspects on full display for your players. Let's say you're fascinated with this kingdom's architecture. Well, in the upcoming campaign, you probably make architecture important for some reason. Perhaps the architecture of this kingdom is creating this divine seal over the lands with how it's created, and that's keeping a demon invasion back. I don't know. My advice for making interesting kingdoms, though, is to make the kingdom's world building relevant, directly relevant to the campaign that your players are in. Trust me, I'm not a big fan of architecture, but if I learn in a campaign that the architecture is super important to the plot and to my character, yeah, I'm going to become invested in that world-building aspect of the kingdom. And, in all likelihood, it's going to stand out to me and the other players more because I'm not thinking about architecture in other campaign worlds. So hopefully that answers your question. Just relentlessly build for your players in the sessions that you're actually running. Next question though, how to defeat the urge to make a setting or its element perfect because the NPCs are competent and make logical decisions. And they gave an example. So there's a city of good aligned necromancers. Through great efforts, they have convinced their neighbors they aren't hostile and are actually pretty helpful and good to have around. They worked out a system for getting bodies without stealing or murdering. They are keeping each other in check so that one does not go undead army crazy and so on. Fun concept, but if it's perfect and without problems, then it's most likely going to feel like a cutscene for the players. So the answer to this question requires us to dive into where problems come from, not only in the real world, but in storytelling. You can have good people who are trying to be as logical and competent as possible and still come into conflict with each other. Misunderstandings, a lack of resources, natural disasters, all of this can put quote-unquote perfect systems into conflict, or at least systems that aren't trying to be evil. I have a good aligned necromancer city in my world, and one of the plots that I thought about creating for it was that the necromancer simply ran out of suitable bodies. Like they had expanded to the point where there were not enough undead to keep on growing their city. So they had to go and take more from their neighbors. Some of the neighbors didn't like that. It caused border conflicts. Nobody is actively trying to be aggressive, however, the aggressiveness comes out nevertheless. But I didn't get to do that plot because this is the thing. People are not logical and they are rarely competent. We like for worlds to feel logical and competent because we're logical and competent, but we're not. We're monkeys. We are creatures of impulse and emotion, and the decisions we make rarely make sense. I graduated with a degree in philosophy, and one of the things that is beaten into you constantly is that philosophy and logic do not win arguments. It's one of the worst ways to practice argumentation. People are rarely, if ever, swayed by logical responses. In fact, most philosophies are created to reflect how people are already acting. They don't tell us what we should do in a lot of cases, but they give us something to point to and say, look, my actions are justified because I'm following a utilitarian philosophy or a Kantian categorical imperative. That probably doesn't mean a lot to most of you, but what I'm trying to get at is that logic is overrated when it comes to world building and realism. People are selfish and impulsive. Players are selfish and impulsive. The reason why I didn't get to run the previous plot for that necromancy city is because the players led a Gnoll army right to the city that had done nothing to them. They were just sitting there in the campaign world. They proceeded to slaughter a fourth of the city, practically by accident. You also have to understand here that these players were a good aligned party. They weren't actively trying to cause a massacre, it just kind of happened. So if you're wanting to overcome a perfect element in the setting, just having people be given incomplete information or just making a mistake is pretty much enough. Yes, this city is full of good aligned necromancers. However, it took one of their diplomats, one drunken bender, to get on the wrong side of another nation, and now the two kingdoms are at the verge of war. And even if you don't like that, competent and good NPCs can go up against other good forces in an antagonistic way just because they don't have any other choice. Something as simple as a blight on the necromancer's crops from all their undead walking around could be enough to send those necromancers on the warpath. No plan survives first contact with the enemy, and even if you create a perfect concept, absolutely flawless, the world can get in the way, and it's up to you as a game master to figure out how the world is getting in the way of this perfect element of my campaign. What problems or obstacles am I throwing out so that my players have to act? That's key as well, because despite us talking about this perfect element of the setting, the players should still be interacting with it in some way. Hopefully that answers the question. Next up, though, do you have any tips for turning your DM brain off when you're playing in another game? Ooh, my group of friends all play together, and we take turns DMing, but I find it hard sometimes not to overanalyze the session as I am playing. Yeah, this is a difficult problem that I struggled with for a number of years and still struggle with to a degree. Because sometimes it's nearly impossible not to analyze a decision that another DM makes, or how you're liking the story or not liking the story, where you think it's going, what you would do with your character. My best advice is to jot those DM thoughts down in a notebook and use them as building material for yourself. Oh, I really liked this session in the moment. Why did I like this session? Or, man, that particular ruling gets to me. I didn't like it. Why didn't I like it? Do I make these kind of rulings in my sessions? Should I change it because now I can see how another player would feel in that moment? Especially if you're a forever game master. The ability to sit down and be a player in these games can be one of the biggest catalysts to your own improvement. So for that reason, I never try and turn my DM brain off. In fact, I try and utilize it in different ways. So like if I'm playing in a session, I might see that one player hasn't gotten the spotlight in a while, so I'll go to them in this period of downtime, and we can have this fantastic role-playing moment about how their character's feeling about a particular event, or maybe getting into some of that player's backstory that hasn't been uncovered in a while. Perhaps in combat, instead of trying to go for the final hit on the boss, I can apply a buff to that player's character so that they can get the spotlight moment of the session. This is stuff I'm normally thinking about as I'm DMing for players, but now when I'm doing it as a player, it just helps me and the DM create better moments for the table. Because not only am I thinking about the storytelling for my own character, but I'm thinking about the storytelling for everyone else's character. And I'm helping to add to the moments that we're creating at the table. It makes me a better player by not turning my DM brain off, because it helps me get into the mindset of, well, the main character isn't my character, the main character is our party. And so when the party's story is better, my own character's story and gameplay is better. My DM brain gets me into that mindset, and it's something that I've been trying to utilize more and more over the years, especially when I am a player. With that being said, the DM brain can sometimes wander into negative thoughts. We can wander into criticisms of other people's games because it's not our own. And you know what? Sometimes we just have to channel those negative thoughts into a journal and come back to them later because we're really just nitpicking another person's game. Instead, we can focus on the fun we're trying to have at the table and just generally being excited to be around a group of people who share our hobby. But sometimes, if the problem persists, it might just be telling us that this group is not a fit for us at the time. Like right now, when I've been playing TTRPGs for more than 10 years, I struggle to have fun in a beer and pretzels, pure joking kind of game for more than about 4 or 5 sessions. I want to have difficult combats. I want to have a villain I can hate. I want my character's backstory to play some sort of role in the game, and those are the preferences that I've developed over years and years of play. So if I'm playing in a game and those aspects aren't being provided for, even after talking to DM and players alike, then it might just be telling me that I need to move on to a different group because that table isn't right for me. And that's okay, because we all have different preferences, and not every game is going to fit what we want from Dungeons & Dragons or any other TTRPG that you're playing. In those cases, your DM brain might be helping to get you out of a game that you're not going to be enjoying as much. I have been in way too many campaigns where I left the sessions feeling frustrated and tired, and like I just didn't have any fun. For the most part, that's not what you should be feeling when you're leaving a session, and if you are, you should talk to your game master about it. But I suppose what I've been trying to say through all of this rambling is to not turn your DM brain off. Listen to it, channel it in a healthy and productive manner, and if it gets to the point where you can't turn it off and it's all negative, take a look at your game and see, is this a group that is fulfilling my preferences for the game? And if it's not, then you have to have a conversation with yourself of, is this something that I should continue playing through? Am I still having fun when I sit down at the table? Hopefully that answers your question. But the next question we have here says, can you make a video outlining how you would run your campaign using the plot webs you created? Specifically, how you would introduce these elements to your players? In what order? What would they learn outright and how versus what they would discover and how? I mean, you're probably not going to like this answer, but it depends on every campaign. I don't know in what order these elements are going to be introduced. The plot web just tells me how the information fits together and what likely avenues there are of the information being discovered. As I'm running a campaign, there will definitely be opportunities for players to discover parts of the plot web, to uncover these nodes and their connections to one another, but it's not really my job at the start to know when they're going to learn this information and how, what they would discover, etc. I can have hunches, I can have guesses, but at the end of the day, it's kind of down to the players. If I sit down and I say, okay, the plot web has to be discovered in this order, in this specific way, this is exactly how the players are going to learn this information, it feels like I'm railroading them to me. And that's not what a plot web is. It's not an excuse to railroad the players. It's just to tell me what the story's shape is, so that I cross my T's and dot my I's, I don't leave anything out, and it feels like all the players are connected in some way, and the story never gets away from us as a group. A plot web is scaffolding for the campaign, but to say when they would discover things or in what order, I couldn't say. Even what information players learn outright is campaign dependent and of course player dependent. I can foresee running a campaign where the players know literally nothing about the plot webs or any of the plot nodes from the start, and I can foresee a campaign where they know practically every plot node from the start. If you want a tactic for how to begin your plot web, the best one I can give is to just pick a node and start from there. Begin branching out in all different directions and see what information unravels. Because that's the thing, it's not about where you start with a plot web, it's where you end, with the plot web filled out, the players understanding all the intricacies, and they go, wait a minute, how did you have all of this planned out from the start? And it's as simple as you saying, well, I took the important aspects of all of your backstories, and I linked them to other important aspects of everyone else's backstories, so that it would all fuse together into this one story. At its heart, that's a plot web, a way of visualizing connections between backstories. It's a way of allowing yourself to be dropped into the improv flow of a TTRPG style of storytelling while not being lost at sea. So how would I introduce these elements? I don't know. In what order? Could be any order. What would they learn outright and how? No idea. Campaign dependent. Versus what they would discover and how? No idea. Campaign dependent. Love it or hate it, this is TTRPG style storytelling. We don't know all the specifics when we start. If we did, we'd be writing novels. We'll start with the Druid subclass, and I probably think that something like Circle of the Stars would fit me best. I always had a love for the night sky, and I think the lower level abilities would be very useful in my everyday life, like Augury for instance, because I'm not going to assume that I'm a high level druid. I'm probably a second level druid. But I get a lot out of my starry form, hopefully. Having magical healing is useful, theoretically. I think the other option would be Circle of the Moon, so I could turn into more animals, but I can turn into animals as a Circle of Stars druid anyway, and I can't turn into a flying animal any sooner, so it'd probably just be Circle of Stars. Now I go to a little bit of a controversial take, because I get to talk about D&D 3rd edition and 3.5, which, that 0.5 is doing a lot of work between those two editions. Technically the same edition, very different if you play them. I think that there is a reason why 5th edition is the most popular version of Dungeons & Dragons, because the earlier versions of D&D had a litany of problems. D&D, I think 3.5 specifically, is a min-maxer's dream. You have so many options with character creation, lots of different rules and supplements, but the game in many respects is fundamentally broken. It's unbalanced. If you thought there was a divide between marshals and spellcasters today, oh my god, the earlier versions of D&D were just unfair, really. I mean, they were built around a Vancian magic system where you literally had to prepare 2 fireballs and a magic missile, a shield spell, etc. before you went into the dungeon. But once they got rid of that and there was no concentration, I mean, things kind of went off the rails a bit. Don't get me wrong, I can see the appeal of the systems, but I liken D&D 3.5 and D&D 4e as like the first 2 Witcher games. If you've never played the first 2 Witcher games, they are a beautiful mess. The combat is wonky, some of the animations are glitchy, the quest systems aren't as good as we might like to see, graphics were middling even at the time, but The Witcher 3 is a masterpiece, and I think that's what D&D 5e is. It is one of the best TTRPGs ever made. We just forget about it because it's so ubiquitous nowadays. But it got a monopoly in the market because of its accessibility, because of its strong foundations. I mean, you can build onto D&D 5e in so many ridiculous ways. You can see all the third-party content that is added to the system all the time. You can play Star Wars in D&D in 5e. Is 5e the most flashy game system? No. Is it one of the most accessible? Yes. And that's why I think we keep on coming back to it. Because if I want to introduce new people to the hobby, I would struggle to do so in 3 and 3.5. They're just not accessible systems, and even veterans in the hobby can find themselves making characters that are completely useless, that literally cannot do anything in a game. I tell this to new players all the time, you have to be actually good at 5th edition to make a D&D character that can do nothing, that literally cannot function. You can stumble into it in 3.5. And then you have this middle ground of 4th edition where this might make some people angry, but 4th edition had a bunch of great ideas. But I did a video where I talked about MCDM's new book, Flea Mortals, and there were a lot of comments saying, oh, this is just 4th edition. I have to say no, because I played 4th edition, and while they have similar mechanics, all the mechanics in 4th edition I think are inarguably worse. Like, 4th edition is filled with all these great ideas that just didn't land. And years later, after Dungeon Masters and the player base have gone through and made their own tweaks to the system, yeah, these ideas were great. Why didn't we love 4th edition? Because 4th edition is very different than some of the things we're porting over from it. Then you go into combat a lot of the times in 4th edition and it just feels janky, too much to keep track of, monster stat blocks that are sometimes a bit incoherent. It feels like an unpolished game, while 3.5 feels like it's trying to do exactly what it set out to do. Have this robust character creation system where you can make exactly the character you want, and it's overwhelming. Now, with all of this being said, I still think you can have a lot of fun with both editions of the game. I think D&D 3.5 and 4E both have a player base that prefer them over 5th edition. And I think that most D&D players should at least play a game in 3.5 and 4E just to see if they like it. If you're in a high power table that really values building strong characters, I can absolutely see why you're playing 3.5 or just Pathfinder 2E. Or if you're really into more tactical, grid-based combat with more balance between all the classes and that's really important to your group, I think 4E is a fantastic system, especially if you have experienced DMs who can help guide you through the system. And final disclaimer here, I have not played nearly as much 3.5 and 4E as I have 5th edition. You can completely disagree with my opinions, and that's fine. This is just my impressions of the system. So hopefully that kind of answers your questions. I know I went off on a rambling tangent a bit, but that just feels like this is the video it's going to be. Prepare for some rambling tangents. Next up, though, how much of the campaign do you have written or prepared before getting the players together to play the game? First time homebrewing a campaign world, and I have a hard time trying to figure out how much of the campaign I should have prepped before session 0. Alright, if this is your first time running a campaign and homebrewing a world, then I would say the only thing that you really need to have for session 0 is a starting town, where the players begin. You don't need to have some epic, expansive campaign world just yet. Just really get down to the nitty-gritty and say, well, what's in the starting town? And have an idea about what the starting quest is going to be. If you want to go a step beyond that, consider thinking about these 4 things. What is the central tension of your campaign? What is the thing that is going to bring you and your players to the table? What is the thing that your campaign is revolving around? If you're playing in a sandbox campaign, it might be something like exploration. You guys are going to have the chance to explore this massive campaign world. Spoiler alert, that's probably going to be a lot more work for you, and I wouldn't recommend it, but that can be a selling point. Maybe the selling point is unraveling a great conspiracy, defeating this ancient, powerful dragon. Perhaps your selling point for this campaign is that you are going to really flesh out the NPCs, and that everywhere the players go, they are going to be meeting people with intricate backstories, with their own plot lines and quest lines, and the world's going to feel alive. Whatever the case, just have in your head or written down what the central tension is. That way you can tell it to the players session 0 so that they can have an understanding of what type of campaign this is going to be. Next, I would heavily encourage you to figure out what is your antagonistic force. Who's the villain of your campaign? It doesn't need to be a villain for your entire campaign, although that's what I usually start with, the BBEG, the antagonistic force that is working against my players as they're going from level 1 to level 20. Instead, you can just think of the villain for the first adventure. Maybe this is the bandit captain that's terrorizing the town. The reason why I really emphasize villain creation is because I think that a D&D campaign is only as good as its villain. The better villains you have, the better antagonists you have in a D&D campaign, the better the players can roleplay their characters, the more the players shine. That villain is the force that is causing characters to act, to be dynamic, to change and grow. The stronger your players' reasons for change are, the more invested they'll be in your campaign. It also helps you as a first-time dungeon master for planning your campaign. If you know the villain and you know what they're trying to do, you know what their motivation is, then you begin to throw down quests that naturally stack on each other. Perhaps your endgame villain is trying to summon a dark god. Well, your first adventure might be the players trying to save a town from a group of goblins. Those goblins are under the authority of one of the BBEG's lieutenants, trying to gather the necessary people and materials for this ritual. After the goblins and the lieutenant are beaten, the players might learn about the general of the BBEG, who is helping to run operations in the local area. Of course, they then go for the general and on and on and on until eventually they beat the BBEG. It helps to make prepping and planning the adventure that much easier. The third thing, though, that I would advise you having nailed down before you start your campaign is the tone. Now, a lot of things go into tone. That can mean genre, it can mean the themes that you're working with, the type of stories that you're telling. But generally, when I'm talking about a new DM running a new campaign, what I mean by tone is, how does it feel to sit down and play your game session to session? Are you going for a more lighthearted tone, or are you going for a gritty, grimdark tone? Are you incorporating a lot of mystery, or is it more of an action-adventure campaign? A huge problem that a lot of DMs have, especially newer DMs, is that they just try and throw everything they have in their heads into their new campaign. We all have a lot of great ideas in our heads, but trying to fit them all in the same campaign rarely works. Oftentimes, especially for newer DMs, it can cause our campaigns to get away from us. We have no idea what to prep next, what feels right, and more importantly, what feels wrong in our campaign. Writing down a few touchstones for yourself before you begin a campaign can be incredibly useful. It is a list that you can return to while you're prepping and running your games to make it feel like you are running this singular story for a singular party of players. And finally, have a list of things that you might want to talk about for a session 0. For instance, here is a list of things that I usually go through during a session 0. I have a welcoming moment where all the players and myself will meet each other. We'll talk about player behavior, topics, and how we're going to handle certain topics inside the game. This is about setting boundaries between each other. Then I'll talk about my DMing style, some more about this campaign, general expectations as well, talking about the schedule of the campaign, how we'll handle player absences, world info, a wish list for players, but I find it very useful for me to have this all out so that the session 0 can run smoothly and so that we don't forget anything as players. Most session 0s, especially for a new group of players, have to do a lot of heavy lifting, so just having a little sheet of paper that you can refer back to so that you can make sure to hit all your bullet points through a session 0 can be incredibly helpful. Hopefully I can remember to place my session 0 template below, and if not, just, I don't know, spam me in the comments or something. I have to do a lot of editing for these videos, so I'll probably forget something. Also, before moving on to the next question, I want to kind of highlight how none of what I really mentioned has to do with world building. Like, yeah, you should probably have a starting town fleshed out so that you know where your players are going to go and interact with session 1. But otherwise, world building can happen piecemeal. You don't have to have it occur all at once. World building in most D&D games is a luxury, not a necessity. So don't feel like you can't run a game if you don't have every bit of your world fleshed out. You technically don't even need to know the history of the starting town. Only build what is relevant for your players. So hopefully that helps to answer your question, makes you feel more confident running your new campaign going forward. But moving on to the next question, this is a two-parter. The first one says, can you give examples on how to keep a story arc villain threatening? Well, I guess the high-level answer is that the players have to constantly believe that this villain can negatively affect them. Notice how I didn't say kill, because at some point, killing players loses all effectiveness. Like, this might seem strange to new Dungeon Masters, maybe even intermediate Dungeon Masters, but killing the players is actually very low on the totem pole of what makes a villain threatening, because if the player character is dead, then that's it. There's nothing left to fear. Death can be a final end, or in some systems like 5th edition, death is a temporary inconvenience at certain levels. But if the villain is constantly running around, threatening or killing NPCs, destroying important towns, potentially whenever the players meet, the villain has a propensity for taking some of their items, all of that can make a villain feel very threatening. Another piece of advice is that the most threatening villains are the ones that are least often seen, but most often heard about. A player's own imagination is a powerful tool, and they will make the villain a lot scarier and a lot more threatening than you ever could inside their own heads. If you have the player stumble upon the aftermath or hear about the aftermath of the villain's actions, then that can be just as good as actually seeing the villain up close. I would also say that the most threatening villains rarely rely on gore, and instead they get into these more existential fears. And what I mean by this is, yeah, sure, a villain who slaughters a town, very threatening, very menacing, sure, it's shock value at that point. But oftentimes, the most menacing thing a villain can do if they're trying to destroy a town is just have the town disappear, become deserted. The players walk through the town and everyone's gone, or the entire town is gone. It's just an open field. And all they can do is question and ask how the villain did this, before they run across maybe a lone survivor that says, oh yeah, the villain is heading towards the town that you just came from. Or they're heading to this very important place and they'll be there in X amount of days. These are the things that make a villain terrifying when they do something to negatively affect the players, and the players don't know how they did it. This strategy is also based around the players caring about your campaign. Without player buy-in to their own characters, the world, and the NPCs in it, it's very hard to make a villain that is actually threatening. Your players have to care about something in your campaign, and then the villain has to directly attack it. One of the most threatening villains in my current campaign world is called the Banker of Bones. And the reason why this particular character is so menacing, so threatening, is because it doesn't threaten the characters with death. No, it threatens the characters with life, or a life so terrible that they wish to die. This particular quote right here is one that I put into one of my lore documents for the campaigns that I run, and it has invoked more terror in players than I could have possibly imagined. Whenever this freak comes around, the players are incredibly threatened because they know that death is not on the line. Death is one of the lowest possible outcomes that could happen. One of the best outcomes, really, is that they die. I also follow this rule of the character being rarely seen, but their presence is often talked about. The players absolutely know the Banker of Bones is in the area, but 95% of the time, the player characters never run across him. Then, if the player characters do run across the Banker of Bones, I always kind of have this internal note that something terrible has to happen. Because the Banker of Bones is supposed to be a very threatening character. Encounters with characters like this or other villains should not be easy. I kind of hold villains to a certain ratio in my head, depending on how threatening I want them to be. For a low tier villain, maybe one bad thing happens per every 3 times they encounter the players. That way they can still hold the mantle of villain while not being incredibly threatening. The players believe, yeah, we can take this person down. An incredibly threatening villain, like a BBEG type, might have a 1-to-1 ratio. Every time the players meet this character, usually something bad is going to happen or something will go wrong. The villain's presence needs to be felt in some way. And for the truly terrifying and threatening characters in a campaign world or setting like the Banker of Bones, we go above the 1-to-1 ratio. Maybe 2 bad things happen for every 1 time the player characters meet this villain. So yeah, to answer your first question, the way to make a villain feel threatening over the course of a story arc is that they have to constantly be threatening something that the players desire or cherish. Ideally, you need to be threatening something other than just the players' lives, because that has very limited mileage. Threatening the lives of the players can only really be done if the players dying will have greater consequences or impact. Let's see, your second question is, can you add 1 unique location to my campaign world? Feel free to come up with anything big or small and have fun. You're putting a lot of pressure on me here. Let's see what I can come up with. I think I'll give you 2 unique locations if that's okay, because I don't know if I can decide between the 2 of them. The first is one of my all-time favorite locations that I've given to players. It's a location called a Chaos Forge that you can place basically anywhere. Deep below ground, there is a pool of basically pure arcane chaos. The instructions for the Chaos Forge are simple. Dip any item in and it will get a random effect. Trying to dip an item into the Chaos Forge more than once will likely result in the item being disintegrated. Unless, of course, this item is an artifact or is made of a sufficiently powerful material. Like platinum, I usually rule in those instances that an item can be dipped in twice. Now, what happens when you dip an item into this Chaos Forge? Well, essentially, you roll on a random table and the item gets a random magical effect. Go wild with what you put on the random table, but, and this is the important part, as soon as an effect is gotten from the random table, cross that out and put in a new effect once the session ends. There should never be a repeat effect on the table because that's what makes this place special. Whenever a new item is dipped into that Chaos Forge, it will always be something new. Players go absolutely feral over this location, especially when an NPC tells them an additional way to use the Chaos Forge. You see, with the right spell, the Chaos Forge can be used to take two magical items and combine them together. So let's say you have a Flame Tongue Longsword and an Immovable Rod. Well, you can dip them both in the Chaos Forge at the same time, cast this ritual, and spend an appropriate amount of gold or diamonds or whatnot, and then you can have a Flame Tongue Longsword that, when a button is pushed on it, is immovable. It becomes an immovable rod. This becomes a great way for players to upgrade their items as they go. And for me, I usually put a diamond or a gold tax on combining these items. The more powerful the enchantments, the higher the tax. I've probably ran this location no less than 7 times over the past 5 years since I came up with it, and every single time it's been a hit. The combo of getting random magical effects and fusing magic items together is just fantastic for players. If a campaign is getting just a bit stale, try throwing in a Chaos Forge. Now, the next location I'm going to give you can be something to fit anything you need in a campaign. It's called the Caraxian Labyrinth box. But of course, in your campaign, you can name it anything you want. Basically, this box is located in the center of a big city in the middle of a shrine. This box seems to be a small black cube and is guarded at all hours of the day for safety. A creature who touches the box is immediately teleported to another dimension which is contained within. This dimension is a strange and twisting labyrinth. Details of the labyrinth itself change based on reports from people who have returned. However, everyone who has returned faced a trial to escape the labyrinth. The reward for escaping the labyrinth is usually a great boon or item provided to the person by the tester within the labyrinth. Now, escaping the labyrinth is very rare. 1 in 10,000 people are expected to succeed, and because of this, the guards only let in those who have been given permission by the mayor of the city to touch the box. Now, I implement this 2 ways. The first way is if you just want to throw a fun dungeon at the players. Maybe you have some cool puzzles, a boss fight, a nice magic item that you want to give your party, but you have no idea how to fit it into your campaign. Well, have an NPC recommend them going and touching this puzzle box. Now, the second way I use this box is, for me, the box kind of has a mind of its own. The labyrinth contains many great treasures, but the Caraxian Labyrinth box always brings a person or a group of people to the treasure that they desire most, that they need the most. Powerful NPCs in the world know this, and so, in a time of dire need, they might tell the party to go and touch the Labyrinth box. It's kind of a Hail Mary shot if the party loses a MacGuffin or needs a really rare item or ingredient. I also try and make the inside of this labyrinth feel really weird and alien from the rest of the campaign setting. If you're running a traditional European setting, maybe this is the opportunity for when they step into the puzzle box to transport them to the Pala Empire from India. Have a completely different vibe and aesthetic to make your players question just how deep your world lore goes. Even if you know nothing from the era that this labyrinth box came from, it can still make for a really unique piece of world building. So yeah, hopefully those 2 locations are good enough. Let me know how they go. Next question, can you talk about the different realms of D&D and how to incorporate them into your world? So this is my thing with the realms that are present in the D&D Forgotten Realms and really any other campaign setting. Realms are there to support what you're already doing in a campaign. I try not to shoehorn in realms and other dimensions, planes that I don't really need to. If the story or another player takes us to one of those realms, great. But I view the realms as more of a storytelling tool and not something that I need to incorporate in every campaign. I don't think I've ever had players visit the elemental plane of air. And I don't know if they ever will, but I'm not trying to necessarily incorporate that plane. In my current campaign world that I'm working with, there is no elemental plane of air or fire or water because I'm just not interested in those. I don't feel that need to shoehorn them into the setting because the Forgotten Realms, for all of its great parts, is just packed in with so much world building that at times it feels kind of bloated and disjointed. Of the planes and realms that I think are really easy to incorporate, those would be the Nine Hells, the Abyss, the Shadowfell, and the Feywild. Oh, and Mount Celestia, or Heaven, or whatever it is in a different setting. The usual incorporation is Hell's where the bad people go, Mount Celestia is where the good people go, the Abyss is where the truly terrible entities come from in the D&D campaign world. Then you have the Feywild, which is where the Fey come from. And the Shadowfell is like a dark echo of the material plane and the Feywild. The Feywild is full of big, expressive emotions and randomness, while the Shadowfell is more muted and is in stasis. The usual incorporations I go with is that the Feywild is usually accessed during the full moon, usually in fairy circles in a forest. The Fey are able to enter the material plane, and mortals from the material plane are able to enter the Feywild. Then, during a new moon is when mortals can enter the Shadowfell and vice versa. If you're trying to enter Hell, you usually need to do so via the help of a devil or dying. Same thing usually holds true for Mount Celestia. Then the Abyss is somewhere you absolutely do not want to go. Demons and demon worshippers are constantly trying to open a portal to the Abyss, and devils and angels and pretty much everyone who is not connected to demons is trying to prevent that from happening. So yeah, I think those are the planes and their incorporations that make the most sense for most D&D campaigns. But again, don't feel like you need to shoehorn any of these things into your particular campaign world. I think each and every one of these realms are storytelling tools for DMs and their players. But if the tool isn't right for your campaign, then just don't use it. And we got 2 more questions from this commenter, so I'll try and tackle those now. The first one is how to write in different nations or groups waging war against one another. Man, this is a big question. Luckily, I have 2 campaigns going on right now that deal with this particular thing. And I think that there are 2 ways to look at the groups and the wars being fought. One is a war of good versus evil. The players are the good guys, the enemies are the bad guys, and the players have to beat the bad guys, else the bad guys are going to take over the world. It is your simple and average, fantasy war plotline. This campaign kind of boils down to having to get allies together and moving towards a particular goal. Or if the players are not directly involved in this sort of war, in the background, all the good guys are rallying together to go and fight this other evil threat. Then your other option is the morally gray conflict, where both sides are acting in their best interest but aren't all particularly good. When players are involved, this is the type of nation war that I like to run, because it forces the players to make tough decisions or to take the initiative and change things about the particular faction they've aligned with. Because especially over the course of a very long-term campaign, fight the bad guys can become a little boring and repetitive. No matter how good you are as a DM, there's only so many times that you can fight the bad guys before you either do something else, win the war, or lose the war. Else the campaign just gets really boring and players start to leave. That's where I like the more morally gray conflict, where the players have to have agency. They have to think about their decisions, weighing the interests of one group within their faction versus the interests of another group. Perhaps the generals on their side wants to destroy a bridge to prevent the enemy army from advancing, but the business leaders and the companies that are a part of the player's faction don't want that bridge destroyed because it's important for supply and trade, and as soon as this war is over, or maybe while this war is happening, it's going to hurt their industrial output. I think these questions are a lot more interesting, and they give the players a more central role in the story because they make those players more of the main characters. If both sides are deadlocked, then the leaders have to look to the players and say, all right, we are at a standstill here. You need to break the tie. Which one of these actions are you going to take? Because we have to look to you guys at this point. Because it's very easy for the player characters to get lost when the war is being raged. Now, I think that there is a campaign that can be told where the players are far from the main characters. They're just grunts on the front line trying to make it. Really an all quiet on the Western Front style campaign that I think would be very interesting. But in most campaigns, the player characters want to be the main characters, or rather, the group needs to be the main character, like I always say. Having the players break ties in decision making in morally gray nations is one of the easiest ways to spotlight them in a war campaign, or in a campaign that has a war going on. You can do this in a good versus evil war, but it becomes a lot more difficult. Another tip I would give too is for different sides or groups of people in a conflict to boil those groups down to figureheads. Now, in real life, different groups and cultures are not monoliths, but in a D&D or a TTRPG game, they kinda should be monoliths. Having too many different NPCs in a war campaign can make things way too confusing for the average player. So just being able to say, alright, when we talk to this NPC, we are pretty much talking to the bankers, or with this NPC, we are talking to the army of this one country, makes things a lot more digestible for the average player. Fold as many roles as possible into one NPC for given factions. That also helps to expedite planning and roleplay sessions. I could probably ramble on about this topic for hours, and in a later video I probably will. But I think the last tip I'll give for this particular topic is to have a particular threshold where for each side they will surrender. Rarely in wars do sides fight until there is complete annihilation. That is not the norm, so for each side you should think of a particular point or threshold where those people are just going to give up. Maybe for one side, it's when the enemy army takes 50% of their cities, or if the enemy army comes within 100 miles of their capital city. For the good guys, it might be if their leadership is dead, if they lose a particular item or relic or the confidence of the people. It might be if they just go bankrupt and don't have the money to keep paying the mercenaries. But that also helps to give achievable goals to your player characters. If an NPC in the know says, oh yeah, like if the army gets to this point, the leadership is going to fall apart, that is an achievable goal that they can set their minds to. TTRPG groups become a lot more efficient when they have a direct goal that they are trying to accomplish, that other NPCs are helping to guide them towards and work to. So yeah, figure out if it's a morally gray war or if it's a good versus evil war, create your figureheads, and then create the victory or really the defeat conditions for either side. So let me just give you like a full example. Let's say I'm doing a morally gray war, and one side is experiencing a famine and needs to go and conquer the other country's breadbasket, basically, the breadbasket of this nation, to get the materials, to get the food necessary for their people to survive the winter. Now, the reason they're picking that particular country to fight, that country repeatedly practices biological experimentation and manipulation on its citizens. This citizenry is treated awfully in principle, so conquering this land is really just a good. Now, of course, the other country goes, whoa, 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 we did nothing to you, and now you're just invading us for our resources. You're completely in the wrong here, we're gonna fight. Then the next thing we would do is create figureheads for each side. I'd probably create a figurehead for the leadership of each nation, then a figurehead for the armies, of course, maybe even figureheads for the diplomatic corps or the dissenting group within each populace. I might create a figurehead for the scientists that practice human experimentation. Maybe these people view themselves as transhumanists and don't actively see what they are doing as evil. They are simply trying to move their citizenry to the next form of evolution. See, at this point we have two sides that the party is equally likely to align with or is going to try and create a compromise between. And finally, we might say that the attacking side will surrender when winter comes, or if they run out of money to continue the fight. Maybe the Mad Scientist Nation is going to surrender if they lose all of their farmland, if their capital is threatened, or they lose mines that they need so that they can get the materials necessary to continue their human experimentation. Boom, we just have the bones of a war that can be taking place in the background of your campaign, or it's something that the players can actively get involved in. And at least at the surface for most players, it's complex enough where it theoretically might happen in a fantasy world. And the players start getting involved in swaying the war to one side or another, they might be looked to for decision making. Let's move on to your final question though, which is, I would also be interested in hearing some of your favorite personal DMing moments or ideas. I'm writing my first campaign and I found it really helpful hearing about the ideas of other DMs have come up with. I'll kind of bookmark this question if you don't mind, because at the end of this Q&A, I'm going to be talking about the West Marches campaign that's going on right now. More videos about me making it will be coming out hopefully in February. There's a bit of a backlog of videos now, but you'll be able to hear about the past, 25 sessions that have taken place. So yeah, you'll probably be able to take some things from there, so just hang on until the end of the video. Next question though, in your opinion, what should the final encounter of any campaign have? I'm talking level 20 and about both mechanics and role-playing. What a great question. So I have taken, how many groups to level 20? I think it's almost 20, if not 20 groups now. So if I've had the chance to do level 20 final boss encounters 20 times, let's say. Let's get the mechanics out of the way first, because I think that's the easiest thing to talk about. Of course, you're going to need a lot of hit points, you're going to need legendary resistances, probably legendary actions as well. Ideally, if you have a main final boss, they should have enough movement to easily traverse the battlefield. A level 20 party being able to lock down a particular enemy and wail on them is not good. They can make mincemeat out of basically any enemy you put in front of them. The regular systems of balancing just fundamentally don't work past about 11th level, and so you kind of have to enter this new state of mind when you're creating combat encounters. In this final encounter, you should probably also have some sort of disruption. And what I mean by disruption is something to affect and stop player abilities. Legendary resistances are a form of disruption, for instance. Other forms of disruption can be attacks that make it so a particular player character cannot heal until the start or the end of a boss's next turn. That's great disruption, especially if you have something like a level 20 cleric with power word heal. At least I think it's power word heal. I don't know, that 1 9th level spell that makes it so you can heal like 900 hit points or whatever. It could also be disruption in the form of limiting bonus actions, putting taxes on players the more they move or attack. Disruption should also probably come in the form of some type of resistances or immunities to damage. Like, let's say you have a wizard that absolutely loves using fire damage. Well, probably at some point in the fight, they should get resistance to fire damage or immunity to fire damage to kind of signal that this is a big encounter. Their normal tactics aren't going to work, and they have to pull out all the stops to beat this final threat. Also, I think one of the ways to make boss encounters more epic, especially final boss encounters, is that if you have a second phase to the boss, you can begin describing the boss looking weak and the players will think, oh my gosh, we're doing it, we're beating the boss, we're pulling out all the stops. And then the boss flips to the second phase when the players just think they're out of gas. And now backed against the wall, the players have to fight the second phase of the boss when they thought they were done. Those have always been some of the most impactful boss fights, when I've been able to bait out that combat-ending move that a player has been saving, and then the boss goes to the second phase. Now, one of the things that I would suggest here mechanically is to do something like the mythical monsters that I think were released in Theros, which is that the boss enters its second phase when its health bar reaches 0. And to not carry that extra damage over to its new phase, or any conditions or status effects. It's basically like a new monster is being put down in front of the players. Also, another DMing trick to make the fight feel more epic while actually keeping the player characters more safe is that the first phase of the boss should focus heavily on AoE attacks attacks that damage multiple player characters and their allies at once. That way, by the time that phase 2 hits, all the players should be at about 50% of their hit points or lower, 50 to 25, let's say. Then, during the second phase of the boss fight, you can make the boss's attacks be more single target focused. However, these attacks are going to be doing a lot more damage now. Instead of taking 15 to 20% of a PC's health per attack, maybe they're taking 40, 50, 60% of a PC's health per attack. But they're not doing as many attacks now, so it's actually less dangerous. Sure, PCs will be pushed to the edge. Probably a few of them are going to go down and jump back up. You might even have the boss sink a melee attack into an unconscious PC, giving them 2 failed death saving throws just for the heck of it. But if you're doing everything right and you're balancing the attacks between the PCs, most of them can be surviving at 5 to 10 hit points for a while through this combat. This will feel like a really close and gritty combat, but level 20 PCs have so many tricks up their sleeve. It will feel like they would have just survived this final combat when, you know, as the Dungeon Master, they were fine. As long as one of them was up and could cast Healing Word, they were going to be good. The final mechanical tip I'll throw out revolves around having a secondary objective in your final combat. I'm talking about getting 3 crystals to stop the summoning ritual from occurring, or having to occasionally crank a wheel so that a dam doesn't burst and destroy the town below. Maybe the player characters have to be performing a ritual during the combat so that they can defeat the boss. Like they just cannot die until the ritual is completed right in front of them. All of this is to make sure that this final battle doesn't feel like a slog. Because I'm telling you, a lot of new DMs, when they run their final battles, they create a big boss monster with a ton of hit points, and then it takes 4 hours to beat that boss. But if there's no variance in the combat in that 4 hours, it just feels like, okay, I will make 4 attacks, or I will cast my Disintegrate, and then I'm going to wait for another 50 minutes, because I tell you, later level D&D combat does not go fast. So giving player characters other objectives and other things to think about is incredibly useful. And also, I said that I had only one last mechanical tip, but I do actually have one more. Think about ways for the battle arena to change over the course of the fight. Maybe the fight shifts into another realm of existence, or the floor caves and the players fall down to a chamber below. Perhaps elements of the terrain begin to break apart. Perhaps new terrain begins to grow. Again, it's a small detail, but just changing up the conditions of the fight helps to make it feel like not as much of a slog. It might still be a bit of a slog just because it's hard to avoid at higher level combat, but we're going to do everything we can to avoid that. Now, in terms of role-playing, this final boss battle should be the encapsulation of your campaign. Ideally, you should think of combats or lines that you can say to the players to get them to remember everything that happened up until this point. Maybe as they swing a sword that they got at first level and have carried through this entire campaign, you can talk about the journey this sword went through and the memories that are filled into this blade as it cuts into the body of the final monster, helping the players to reflect on everything that has come before. If you have really strong themes in your campaign, you can have this final boss monster or their minions begin to say lines that reflect those themes. Like, if your campaign has a strong theme of found family, the boss might say something to the effect of, family is weakness. Or your little family built of discarded parts cannot defeat me, or something like that. However, doing these things gives your players hooks to begin to roleplay their characters mid-combat. You can set their characters up for heartfelt speeches or cool quips in the middle of this fight. Do as much as possible to not let the role-playing end when dice are rolled. This might be something that you can talk to your players about as they're even rolling initiative. In this particular combat, there is no limit on talking on your turn. We are not only rolling dice, but we are role-playing during this final confrontation. And part of that is also on you as a dungeon master. For me, I like to give my villains final monologue in the middle of combat. Whenever they take their turn, use a reaction, use a legendary action, I can give a small chunk of their monologue towards the players. We are already in combat. They cannot stop the monologue now. Or really, the way to stop the monologue is to destroy the BBEG. If ever there was a time to do an in-fight monologue, it's the final encounter of the campaign. But I'd like to switch gears for just a quick second and say that despite me talking about this final encounter in terms of combat, the final encounter of a campaign does not need to be combat. I've had a few campaigns where the final encounter is a difficult choice, a speech in front of a coliseum full of NPCs trying to sway the crowd to their side. And honestly, some of the final encounters that weren't combat are the ones that stick in my mind most prominently. Especially if the campaign is more role-playing focused, as combat over the course of the character's adventures just wasn't the main focal point of what they were doing. In those campaigns, it just felt right for the final thing the players were doing, like the final test. Because that's what an encounter is. It's a test of the players. Because that's what an encounter is. It's just a test of the players' skills as they use items and their abilities to try and overcome a challenge. So in some situations, I wanted the final encounter to be the encounter that they did most often throughout the campaign. And for some parties, that wasn't combat, and I thought, yeah, that's fine. I still played soaring music in the background, the players were still on the edge of their seats, and there were still cheers of victory, or exasperated cries of defeat and anguish. All those same emotions were there that I usually find in a final combat encounter. So if you guys out there, you new and old DMs, haven't heard this already, let me be the first to say, it's okay for the final encounter of your campaign to not be combat. In fact, sometimes those are the most memorable campaigns of all. But if you do want to do a combat encounter, I mean, just kind of rewind the video, because I told you, yeah, you were here, you heard all about it. But it's more than an hour into the video at this point, and I still need to answer questions from my patrons on my Patreon. If you haven't already, you can go over to my Patreon and check it out. You'll get a ton of great perks and benefits, one of which is access to a monthly Q&A video. Sometimes it's a little late, but December was a busy month. Also, I offer personal DM coaching at my Dungeon Master tier. So if you want one-on-one help from me, head over there and check it out. Both these people did. So I'll start with Alejandro first. If you made your top 5 categories for evaluating a GM's skills, what would these be? I know you mentioned pacing was the most important, but which others would you put in there? So you mentioned it, Alejandro. I would definitely put pacing in that list, and I say pacing as the rate in which a D&D narrative, or any TTRPG narrative, you don't just run D&D, Alejandro, but the pace at which a TTRPG story moves forward, the pace at which you throw in new characters or plot points. Like, part of pacing for any TTRPG is you, the game master, controlling, well, how many plot coupons do the players need to acquire in order to do the thing? Like, for instance, there can be a TTRPG campaign where it takes the players 40 sessions to go and pull off a heist at some high security bank. This is a campaign with very slow pacing. On the flip side, you can have a campaign where it takes the party 1 session to pull off that same heist at that same bank. In one campaign, the party has to do everything from getting the materials, bribing the guards, and actually executing the plan to get inside and rob the bank. In the faster campaign, though, it boils down to a few die rolls to do all the planning, maybe a few flashback sequences while they're in the bank, some abstracted combat and movement, and boom, you've done the same encounter. So how a game master paces their game, I think, is incredibly important. And part of that importance boils down to, what do your players want? If your players want you to pick up the pace, then that is a part of your GMing. I've had players who wanted me to pick up the pace. I've had players who wanted me to slow down the pace. And if you can adjust your pacing to fit the players that you are playing with, I think you are well on your way to being a great game master in any system. The second category I would use for evaluation, though, is maybe even more important than pacing now that I think about it, and it's consistency. And I say consistency to represent 2 things. One is consistency inside of game, and another is consistency outside of game. Consistency inside of game is one of the easiest things for DMs to do, is consistency with your rulings, how you're treating your players, or even what the feel of the story is. Game masters that are not consistent in game will start to lose player buy-in. We are trying to get players to experience verisimilitude, breaking that boundary between the story and the real world. You need them to feel like they are within the world of the game to have the most buy-in. So when rulings or parts of your campaign world are inconsistent, it begins to break that verisimilitude. It could also cause player resentment to some degree. However, I also talk about consistency outside of the game, primarily around scheduling. I know, scheduling is the bane of a lot of DMs' existence, but consistency for when you play the game is 50% of a successful campaign. Just getting players to show up every week and getting yourself to show up when you schedule the session. One of the surefire ways to kill your campaign is to schedule a session and then cancel 10 minutes before. I mean, everyone hates that, and life happens. But in my experience, it's a lot better for the health of your game to go on hiatus until your life or situation becomes more suitable to consistent games than to have this period of time where it's not play for 2 weeks, play, then cancel, not play for 3 weeks, then maybe you play after 3 months. Players become annoyed, they stop being as invested in the campaign, and then they don't schedule that period of time anymore because they begin to think, oh, well, we're just not gonna play, so I can schedule something else in this time slot. That's how you have TTRPG groups often slowly deteriorate until members just leave, and then there's no one to play the game. So pacing and consistency, definitely important. Another category I think I would obviously put in is encounter building. For many systems, you're going to be tested against something in the game. If we're taking Dungeons and Dragons, often those tests come in the form of something like combat or puzzles or traps. The way a game master builds encounters for their specific system I think is important. And this also revolves around the group that you're playing with, and also the system that you're using to a degree. I'm building encounters completely differently if I'm playing D&D 5e or Blades in the Dark. I think it's also important for game masters to hit that right level of difficulty for encounters. You don't want every encounter to be so easy it's a cakewalk, but also you don't want every encounter to be the most difficult thing the party has ever done. Ideally for me, I want encounters that are challenging and test the players in some way, but aren't trying to leave them like shaking with anxiety at the end of it every single time. And occasionally, I want to sprinkle in some more easy encounters that players can just walk right through. I think also a part of this category is just the overall design and interesting ideas that a game master throws into their encounters. What new mechanics are you giving the monsters to test the players in ways they haven't before? What cool trick or idea have you added into the latest puzzle? I think all of this is very important. Then for the fourth category, I'll probably go improv. Improv is something that is present in every TTRPG that I've ever played in. How a game master handles improving during sessions and going in places that they didn't expect with the narrative is a big part of the game. Can you roll with unexpected player choices and make it seem seamless? If the players can't tell what's planned and what's improv, to a degree, that's good. But I think this category also encapsulates when game masters realize when they have to prep. I am not a proponent for a total reliance on improv. I've never seen a game master do it successfully, at least over the course of a long-term campaign. Again, there might be unicorns out there, I've always said this, but the average game master, I think, needs to hear that they need to do more than just improving through sessions. I've come across multiple game masters who said, I'm fantastic at improv. Improv is my strength, so I'm just gonna improv this campaign and go from there. Those games crashed and burned hard after a while. They quickly went off the rails and the group just disintegrated. But on the other hand, I've had game masters that tried to plan everything about a campaign, and those failed too. So knowing when to improv and improving well, I think both are encapsulated in this category. And I think the fifth category would probably be patience. A lot of game masters either lack patience or have way too much patience. This is patience with new players, patience with problem players, patience when it comes to revealing parts of your story in the campaign. Patience is a virtue and a hard thing to quantify, but I think for a lot of game masters, having that right amount of patience, not only with yourself, but with your players and your campaign, and everything else surrounding it, is what takes you to the next level of running the games, to mastering TTRPGs. And I think you will also notice here that I did not include a narrative category or story building, because at the end of the day, it's also the player's responsibility to help lean into that storytelling. You could craft the best story ever as a game master, but if your players aren't biting or they aren't adding to what you're putting out there, then it's just gonna fall flat. I mean, heck, there are examples of this with live actual play D&D games where professional game masters have their stories fall flat because there's just not that buy-in from the players. So if you had to judge yourself and your GMing, these are the 5 categories I would use. And if you are getting better with one of these 5 categories every time you sit down and run a game, then in no time you will be an amazing game master. Next question though from Jackson, it would be cool to do a breakdown of how to best incorporate terrain for interesting combat encounters, elevation, water, fire, rivers, cover, etc., as well as how the map can change as characters interact with it. This is an entire video in and of itself, and really the use of terrain is more of an art form than a science. But at its core, terrain does 2 things. It changes how the characters are moving, or introduces some danger. Some of the time with something like fire, terrain does both at once. Think of terrain as breaking up characters moving in straight lines. With terrain, they have to think about how they are going to get to point B from point A. So if you're wanting to use more terrain in your encounters, think about different avenues your players can take to get to the same location. Honestly, one of the best ways to learn what you like from combat maps and how to create them is to look at top-down views from video game map design. See how some of the designers of some games incorporate cover, but go beyond that. Say, why did they place that car there? Ask, why are there railings for players to run up and along? Question why there is a hallway linking between 2 rooms and what that does. What would happen if you removed that hallway? How would the map change? Back in my early days of game mastering, I would just take Counter-Strike maps and put them into like Roll20. I'd remake them in the software, and slowly I began to realize why certain terrain is where it is. Here I can show you an example of how simple terrain impacts how a battle operates. This is a really rough map of a combat encounter I ran a few days ago. The general premise is that the players are walking down this path, and on either side popped up some enemies. They couldn't run up the green slopes without having to make a skill check, so instead they were funneled through these different avenues. It was a small change to the encounter, but it also gave enemies the ability to get cover by backing away from the edge, or setting up at different choke points along the sunken road. Some were up in the trees firing down at the players below. You don't need to do a lot with terrain to make it feel very impactful in combat. The best advice I can give Jackson for putting down terrain in combat encounters is, how will this terrain cause my players to move differently, or how will this terrain potentially damage my players? Damaging terrain can wall off different areas of the map, while movement-based terrain provides players with different paths that they can move. It creates choke points and fighting zones and cover. So to kind of answer the second part of your question, when the terrain moves, you are actually changing the places where the players cannot go, or you are changing the movement paths of the players. So a cool thing you can do with terrain is, let's say the players need to hit a lever, but it's within fire. The players then need to move the fire to a different spot on the map or get rid of it so they can access this new area. Or if you want to get really tricky with terrain, let's say you put an enemy that is unbeatable to the players normally. Let's say it's a massive Hydra and they're like level 2 characters. Well, on the map there might be giant pillars or stalactites hanging from the ceiling. Now the players can use that terrain to injure the enemy, and conquer this encounter in a way they couldn't if not for that terrain. The players can then use those zones of damage to their benefit. Now if you're going to do this technique, you have to properly foreshadow that. You can say something like the stalactites wiggle on the ceilings, or the columns are crumbling and look rather weak. You might be able to push them over. If you don't do this, the players might just believe that these are stationary points on the map. So hopefully this has given you a few ideas about how to incorporate terrain in your own games. Remember, think about terrain in terms of movement paths or damage restrictions. There is more to terrain, but if you're just trying to get into it, that's how I did it. And if you want to learn more about terrain design, just look at professionally designed video game maps. Map designers are paid for a reason, so check out some of the most popular maps and try to reverse engineer why the map was built that way. Because I guarantee you, those maps are not random. Alright, let's head back to the YouTube audience with another question. How would you handle a player who is deeply passionate about the campaign and lore and everything in between, who wants to play a character that will multi-class into 2 homebrew subclasses? Are they your subclasses? They've been a DM before and don't want the subclasses to be broken mechanically or disrupt the overall plot. They encourage collaboration with the DM on backstory, teamwork with other players, and are up for mechanical changes to the subclasses for balancing, including as the game goes on. By the way, it is a time rewinding barbarian, like Echo's ult from League of Legends, I think that is, and a portal creating rogue, like the Portal video game. Time and space theme. Also, this player is me. Okay, I'm an experienced dungeon master and I don't know you as a player. My initial reaction would be, alright, let me read through these subclasses. If you're open to making balancing changes with them, then I'd probably allow you to do it. That is, if I had trust in you as a player and the homebrew subclasses weren't terrible. I mean, seriously, you can look online and you will just find some terrible homebrew subclasses. But if you're the player in this situation, I would ask, well, how experienced is your dungeon master? How confident are they? Do they do game design for a living, or do they have a passion in game design? If they're a new dungeon master, I would absolutely not recommend you do this. If they're a dungeon master who just doesn't want to deal with 2 new homebrew subclasses, then I'd say don't do this, just play regular subclasses. Every game master and every party is different. If you're with a game master in a group who is all for this, then by all means, go ahead. I've tested some of my homebrew before in other people's games, and a lot of my players have played my homebrew subclasses and classes, but I wouldn't even consider broaching the subject of running 1, much less 2 homebrew subclasses with a new dungeon master. So TLDR, if you're getting pushback in any way, or this is not a dungeon master who has finished a campaign before, like legitimately taken a party from level 1 to at least level 10 and finished their story, who has a great grasp of the mechanics present within D&D 5th edition, then don't try it. Homebrew is a very dangerous thing in some parties, and I think we all homebrew to some extent. But usually I try and let that be the prerogative of the dungeon master. Final viewer questions of the day though. I really enjoyed your 2 videos on the West Marches, and after years of wanting to do one, I'm finally putting pen to paper on one. I've been running D&D for about 5 years, but I've always played and ran more roleplay heavy narrative campaigns where we gloss over the broader strokes of exploration. So here's my question. I'm fascinated by hex crawls, but never really explored them, and I'd love to get your opinion on using those types of elements for a West Marches game. What pitfalls can I avoid, and how can I give myself the best shot of making exploring the world fun and engaging outside of the narrative threads and missions themselves? And then there's a follow-up question saying that this is the first time I'll be running a game completely online. Any sage advice would be appreciated. I'll tackle the hex crawl and exploration stuff first. One of the biggest pitfalls with a hex crawl is overpacking each hex. Ideally, if a group of players go to a new hex, there should always be something there. Maybe some treasure to find or a town to explore. But if you're trying to pack 12 different encounters into one hex, or, I think this is the worst thing, having many hexes that are just plain empty, then you'll run into problems with exploration. The first example will mean that your players never move beyond the starting hexes because there's just so much to do. The latter example makes exploring feel boring and like they don't want to move on to the next hex. My recommendation would be, what do you think is fun about exploration? At least for me, in my perspective, exploration is fun because of what you can find. So like in the West Marches game that I'm running now, when the players are traveling, they're constantly looking for new things. New map information, new missions to go on, new items, supplies for the camp they're a part of. Heck, they're always trying to go out and find new NPCs that they can bring back to their camp and interact with. So I'm trying to make exploration feel fun and exciting because they never know what they can find around the next corner. Now, in the campaign I'm running, there's danger everywhere, but they desperately need these new items, resources, and allies. So they want to explore everything in a given location. And that's something they're having to contend with in my game because they have a time limit, and because exploration is so good for them, they don't want to move away. If your campaign doesn't have a time limit and they're just hex crawling around the map, then making sure each hex has something new for them that they can use to their benefit, I think is an absolute home run strategy. The player stumbling across a dungeon with a legendary item inside while on a hex crawl is hugely satisfying for both you and the players, and it only needs to happen once for every single player involved to think, man, maybe that next hex has a legendary item. Maybe it has a treasure map or a powerful NPC or a location that's gonna blow my mind. But maybe the fun of exploration for you and your players is not about what you get, but it's the journey along the way. And if that's the case, then focus on interesting puzzles, cool and unique combat encounters, the NPCs they meet along the way, or perhaps specific survival challenges for them when they're out there in the wilderness. Whatever the case, figure out what is appealing to you and your players regarding exploration and really hone in on that. It sounds like you haven't done a lot of these exploratory campaigns before, so give you and your players a few sessions. Really take good notes and see what plot hooks and things they show a lot of interest in. Now we can go to your secondary question, because most of the games I run are online. At this point, I have players scattered across the world, so there's very few times we can all actually get together in person. My first thing that I would probably say is to have a dedicated voice chat system, apart from whatever virtual tabletop you're probably going to be using. I personally prefer Discord, but for a lot of virtual tabletops like Roll20 or Foundry, I've just found that their voice system is a little more inconsistent. I prefer to go with a dedicated voice system. Secondly, I would say to put a decent number of hours into learning your virtual tabletop of choice. If you're new to online games, I would probably recommend Roll20, but the best virtual tabletop I've ever used is Foundry VTT. If Roll20 was a Honda Civic, then I think Foundry is a Ferrari. You have so much more control as a player and as a dungeon master. Plus you have insane modding capability and stability. I truly believe that Foundry is a year or two ahead of Roll20 at any given point. And I know that Roll20 looks free, but as someone who used it for years, I can say it's not, because the initial use of the software provides you with so little actual storage space that you basically have to upgrade almost immediately. Then if you want to access even more storage, which you'll probably need, or mods to change the software for what you need, then you have to pay even more money. Foundry VTT is a one-time cost, has mods straight from the get-go, is way more powerful of a system, and I think it's just better. It doesn't have some of the same glitches and system requirements that Roll20 did. It requires more time to get under your belt, but I think it's just more powerful. So if you want the simpler option, and especially if it's your first campaign, Roll20. If you're going to be doing this for a while, or after a year you start running up against the edge cases of Roll20 and feel like it's limiting you, just head over to Foundry VTT. I can personally vouch for it, and it's the best VTT I've used. Like seriously, it's an absolutely phenomenal product. I'm not sponsored by them in any way, but I do love their software so very, very much. I use it for every single one of my games. I would also say if you're running games online, to keep the session length a bit shorter. Attention spans tend to go down when you're not in person. So if you're used to running 4 or 5 hour games, I would honestly recommend you cutting that down by like half. It's just harder to keep people's attention when you're looking at a screen, even if you're video calling each other. So just keep that in mind and expect for the sessions to maybe be a little bit shorter for best results. Now, to keep people's attention spans and to help communicate tone and environment, I would also say that you should probably make an investment into music and ambient noise that you're going to be playing during sessions. The music and ambient noise, especially with people with ADD or ADHD, can help them tune in and focus on the session. Or a music change can help convey to the players what the specific tone of this scene is when they can't see your body language and each other's body language. There are a ton of great music channels online that you can get music from. You can also head over to the Incompetech website with Kevin McLeod. I mean, godfather of free, copyright-free music. He has literally hundreds of songs for any environment or mood that you need, and you can just download them for free from his website. Although I would highly suggest, if you guys are using his music, that you support him, because literally he is a godsend for all of us who are looking for music for our D&D campaigns, and I think to kind of all YouTubers out there who use his music. I mean, if you go through his audio library, there are definitely some songs that you have heard before. See, another tip is don't be afraid of what's called splash pages, or pages and images that you can pull up to show the environment as players are walking through. If your players are walking through a city, you can pull up an image of a fantasy city you found online. It's just another layer that you can use to help bring players into sessions. But speaking of bringing players into sessions, I kind of want to bring you back into my Solandis campaign. Because the last time I recorded one of these Q&A videos, we were just about to start session 1, I think. That was middle of November. We'll call it November, 12th. Right now, as of recording this video, it is January 13th. And on the 17th, we are about to run our 26th session of Solandis. Yes, you heard that right. We have been able to do 26 sessions in about 2 months with the West Marches style campaign. You might be asking, well, how did you do this? Well, when you have a sign-up page and a group Discord and the ability to ping 20 players at any time and say, hey, want to run a session in 3 hours? You can get a lot of sessions done. I'm absolutely blown away at how easy it is to just play TTRPGs at any time, especially if you have multiple DMs and a lot of players. I'm overjoyed at just how many new people have gotten to play TTRPGs over the course of the last 2 months. And I think it's so easy because now anytime I would sit down to watch Netflix or play video games, I can instead be a part of a TTRPG game. Honestly, I am kicking myself for not running a West Marches style campaign sooner. And I will say it's a West Marches style campaign because it does focus on exploration and has no set time or date. Those are the only 2 requirements of a West Marches campaign. I saw some people in the comments section of my first West Marches video saying that because it has a narrative, it's not a West Marches campaign. And I don't think that's true, especially because I have no idea where the narrative is going. I set up a quote-unquote villain, we'll get to that later, a general world, and a general goal for the first arc of the campaign, but the players have gone in completely new directions that I had never anticipated, which I think is part of the joy of a West Marches campaign. But not knowing where the story's going to go and then just not doing anything to set up the sandbox, I think is 2 completely different things. Especially because a lot of my players come and sit down wanting a narrative that they can jump in and interact with. I have players who actively do not want to be in a sandbox, who have told me to my face, if this campaign was going to be a pure sandbox, they were not interested. So if you're going to set up your own West Marches style campaign, don't be afraid to tailor it to what your group of players at that point want. It is your West Marches campaign. Riff on the basic formula however you want. Your take on the formula is going to be different than my take on the formula, and that's okay. But now I suppose it's time to get down to updating all of you about what's been going on. And if you're a part of the Solandis campaign, or at any time in the future want to play in this campaign, leave now. This information is not for you, and is full of a ton of spoilers that is going to ruin your day. Ready? 3, 2, 1. First things first, motherfuckers. Althara the Impure is not the villain of the campaign. I know it's crazy, right? But she was never supposed to be the villain of the campaign. The actual villain is a titan known as Astodea, who is in the lore of my campaign. Her epithet is the Blighted Scourge, and her arrival on this particular ring in my campaign world, and her arrival is a part of the 4th type of narrative arc for campaigns. I know, I've only told you about 3 arcs in that video that I posted so long ago. Story arcs, narrative arcs, and campaign arcs, right? Well, there are actually 4 types of arcs, and I'm going to reveal to you the 4th kind of arc right here and right now. It is called a world arc. The world arc is what happens to your campaign world across campaigns. It is the greater story that you and your players are telling. Now, I didn't put this in the other video because some of you who have never completed a TTRPG campaign before should have no aspirations of doing world arcs. Doing world arcs is very, very complicated and incredibly stressful. But if you nail the world arc, it should feel like every campaign is in the same cinematic universe. If you want to think about Marvel, the end of the world arc for them was defeating Thanos. They just called the world arc the Infinity Saga. Well, the world arc that this campaign world is in right now is a war between the gods, basically, and the Titans who are coming back from exile. And this Titan's arrival to this particular spot in the campaign world had been foreshadowed multiple years ago. So really, the overarching plotline is the coming back of this Titan who is blighting the world and trying to take over this particular area. Yeah, that whole Althara thing, that ain't true at all. So let me introduce you to some of the big players in the campaign going forward. One of the biggest players is this character named Bloom. Or rather, their body is named Bloom. In fact, they had made a deal with a powerful devil to basically have another spirit called Angel inhabit their body and fight the impure for them. This devil's name is Bob, also known in my campaign world as the Broker of Despair. Bob is an important character. No, Bob is not actually his name. It's a nickname. But we'll talk about Bob later. He's going to become very important. Now, eagle-eyed viewers, now that you've had the big twist revealed, can you guess which person is actually inhabiting the body of Bloom? If you said Althara, whose name translates to angel, yes, you were right. Does this player know this information? They absolutely do not. But they are starting to put together potential pieces as they are getting visions as the campaign goes along about Althara's past, which I think is a great way of explaining the backstory of what they believe to be the main antagonist of the campaign, and it gives this particular player a mystery that they can sink their teeth into. Another notable NPC that you should probably know is a character called Damien. Damien watched his entire village be killed by a creature known as the Blackhorn. He watched his father die, and as he did, his father's power being able to transform into a werewolf passed to him. So now Damien is running around and he can transform into a werewolf, but he doesn't know why. He is also searching for his people that he got separated from. Next, we have a character called Andreas Wolfgang. He's an orphan from the city of Teprez, which was destroyed by the Impure, and he appears to have nothing special about him. However, this is one of my best players, and he came to me and he said, look, I want you to go 10 out of 10 hard on this guy's backstory. I don't know what his deal is, but I want you to go hard. So I absolutely am. What you have to know about this guy, though, is he's built to be an absolute tank. His job is to protect the party at all costs. In parallel, there's another character called Thomas Blythe. Thomas is an old soldier who got separated from his two sons during the war. His entire motivation is to try and recover his two sons who he lost in the Battle of Teprez. Next, there's a character known as Talisman, who's from a corrupt church from another point in the campaign map. He was essentially banished to this place and told to help the brigade because he was caught using magic that the church deemed heretical. Spoiler alert, it's not heretical magic, and the way this character interplays with this corrupt church is a big part of the campaign. Well, at least I thought, until they actually started dabbling in heretical magic, but we'll get to that later. Next up, we have a character called Varos Loken, who was part of a group of soldiers from another point in the campaign world who came to fight. However, during the battle, he and his entire platoon was killed, but Varos was resurrected and now hears the voice of his mother in his head at all times. The player knows that this voice is evil and definitely not this character's dead mother, but he doesn't know what exactly the voice is. I know, we've already been through a lot of characters, but there's just 3 more I need to tell you about. 3 more and then we're good. Next up we have Be Good. Be Good was one of the flesh monstrosities stitched together from parts of different dead people and was sent out into the world. They gained sentience when a wizard they were fighting struck them with a special lightning bolt. The wizard died but gave them a black onyx pyramid and told them that they needed to give that pyramid to the last storm witch. Then the wizard died as he told them to be good. Now this cool 2-week-old flesh monster has been sent out into the world. Next up though, we have a character called the Deer. The deer is a deer with telepathic powers that carries a sword in its mouth. It serves the Archfey Zishan, and it's really weird. Yes, this is a player character, and honestly is one of the best characters so far in this campaign. And finally, we have Kelos Sky. Kelos resembles an angel with 5 black wings when we first meet her. She has pitch black eyes, and her backstory is that her parents, her 2 fathers, kept her in a house basically locked away for 18 years until they both did not come back one day. These gods worshipped a god called Zoria, who spent most of her time gazing up at the night sky. Then, as soon as Kelos, nicknamed Ki, left the house, she was contacted by a patron, who they just call Z. This started a patron relationship between the 2 of them. Z would constantly offer Ki help and powers, and whenever Ki accepted, they would gain an additional black wing on their back. Ki has also become rather sickly, so she has to transform into her angelic form in order to basically make it through the day. And there's an underlying tension of not wanting to revert back to her true self. But the longer she stays in Z's angelic form, the more Ki begins to lose herself. Now, there are another 15 player characters that we could talk about, but I'm trying to give you the high-level overview of the last 25 sessions, so buckle up. This West Marches campaign started incredibly simply, with a bunch of these characters meeting up and making their way to the brigade. The characters and the players were introduced to the Archfey and many of the mechanics that they were going to be using in order to progress through this West Marches campaign. The first session was very small, a quick combat, introductions between characters, and just letting players get comfortable in the world. They went on a few successful missions after this until they went on a mission called Gold Garden. Gold Garden was a mission to go to an old alchemist's hut and to gather medical supplies for the brigade. This mission went incredibly wrong as some of the players involved, including Bloom, Thomas, and Damien, basically ran straight into the jaws of a few powerful impure. They got their asses absolutely handed to them on a silver platter, and one of the player characters got kidnapped. They were taken to the alchemist's hut where experiments were performed on them. However, Damien shifted into his woven form and was able to drag the rest of the party members back to safety. This was the first time in the West Marches campaign so far where they realized, oh my god, we can fail these missions and the campaign will just keep on moving on. We don't have any plot armor. And that was, I think, a turning point in this campaign, because in a West Marches campaign, when nobody has plot armor, the tension ratchets up that little bit more. It was honestly incredible to hear the players talk pre-Golden Garden mission and post-Golden Garden mission, because they thought they were still invincible, that they were the main characters. But then realizing that the main character is the brigade and not their characters individually made them go, wait a minute, we have to plan for each one of these missions. But after failing the Gold Garden mission, at this point, they needed to go and get medicine, because one of the aspects of this West Marches campaign is basically long resting is a resource. It's not called long resting in this system, it's called a complete rest, but they needed to get medicine in order to make sure their characters were at peak capacity. So a group of characters consisting of Andreas, Thomas, Damien, Bloom, and the deer ventured to a hospital. This hospital had been abandoned when the impure swept through, but they were going there in hopes of finding some leftover medical supplies. Inside the hospital, they were able to find a new NPC, a person named Margot Fabre. Margot was an exorcist for one of the Archfey, Canaston, before everything went down. She fled to Prez and was hiding here in the hospital, and the reason she was hiding there is because the hospital was the hunting grounds of the Blackhorn. By this point, the party hadn't picked up any medicine, but Damien was itching to get a crack at the Blackhorn, and everyone else was, more willing to head deeper into this facility to see if they could get any of this medicine. What preceded, friends, is one of the most tense hour and 30-minute periods of time that I have ever experienced, as the party crept through the hospital and soon realized that they were being hunted by the Blackhorn. They realized to their horror this thing was bigger than them, it was intelligent, and it was fast. They heard the Blackhorn attempting to draw them closer to it. As this happened, the party began to run away, and they passed by a locked door, which they knew had survivors that they knew the Black Horn was picking off, but they chose not to go inside and help those people. This will become important later. Eventually, after running through the hospital, they provoked the Black Horn, who began to chase them through the darkened hallways. Everyone was screaming and was terrified. This thing was way beyond their level, and it was doing damage that none of them could survive. However, it kept on repeating two words, carefree, over and over and over again, that the party never really picked up on. Eventually, as they were running, the Black Horn cornered Damien and Bloom. As the Black Horn went to try and strike Bloom, as soon as Bloom touched it, the Black Horn began to shriek, and Bloom had a vision of their past. Well, not their past, of Althara's past. This was the first hint at the spirit's true identity. The Black Horn recoiled in horror because Althara partially helped to make the impure, and that energy, as it was attacking itself, basically rebounded at the Black Horn. Althara's power makes it so that her children can't really attack her. Eventually, though, they escape the hospital with Margot, and on the way back, Margot drops the bomb that one of Thomas's sons, Philip, was a person that she saw walking around in the hospital but wasn't able to get to. Thomas, horrified, runs back to the hospital and finds that all the survivors had left in the commotion. This player had walked right by one of their sons that they were trying to find. Session after session after session, Thomas had been relentlessly looking for his son, and this was a massive gut punch to the character. I wanted to give him a win, but they were so terrified of this Black Horn that they couldn't even think about what was going on. But maybe you found the other hint that was present with the Black Horn. Because if you're into etymology, that's the study of words, I believe, you might realize that Blythe actually means carefree. You see, Thomas's other son had been transformed into the Black Horn. He was stalking around his other brother Philip because some part of him in there was trying to ask for help. When the Black Horn saw his father, he kept on saying carefree. He was really trying to say Blythe, but the corrupting powers of the Blossomed and the Impure were stripping that ability away from him. Which means right now we have a ton of player characters and the entire brigade set up to go after the Black Horn at some point. Damien wants that thing dead. Now the problem with that, though, is, of course, that is one of Thomas's sons. I have no idea how it will play out, but I am equal parts excited and terrified to see how this plotline will go. Hopefully they'll be able to find out the true nature of the Black Horn before it's too late. But after this mission, a few player characters agree that now that they have the medicine, they can heal up and go back to the alchemist's hut and get back the friend that was kidnapped. This is the first time that Kilo, Sky, and B enter the campaign. With these new allies, the player characters go back to the alchemist's hut, which is now under high alert, and try the exact same thing. I'm serious, they run right into combat, with even more enemies this time. They have little more than basic weapons, and things are not going well. However, at this point, the player character uses their power to call upon their patron and get a miracle. This miracle stuns the enemies for long enough for the player characters to turn the battle around and just win by the skin of their teeth. But when this miracle is performed, Key gets another wing, going from 5 wings to 6 wings. It is at this point that some of the other players begin to suspect what's going on. You see, the player who made Kilo Sky brought me the backstory about 20 minutes before the session was going to happen. I didn't have a lot of time, but by the grace of God, I knew exactly how this was going to fit in. You see, in my campaign lore, already pre-established, there is a character who had 10 black wings and who is related to the sky and whose name started with Z. The player to this day has not read the lore, so they have no idea they perfectly created a warlock to the Titan Queen known as Zelona, the Sky Mother. And again, she was described as a Titan with 10 beautiful black wings. However, she was sealed away during the last God and Titan war. However, when Kelos reaches 10 wings and is linked enough to Z, she becomes a vessel for the Titan Queen to escape. Some of the other astute players who recognized this piece of lore before from other campaigns basically at this moment realized what was going on, but so far for the past few months have been sworn to secrecy. So out of character, I and some other players know that Kelos Sky is a ticking time bomb. But this ticking time bomb saved the day and allowed them to go down into the alchemist shed, recover their lost PC, but also they found a new NPC down there. They found a woman by the name of Claudia Delacroix. Claudia is a vampire with a dark past who immediately Damien started flirting with. I'm so proud of this player because they have never once flirted with an NPC before. So I was very happy with the character growth, and also, we both agreed, it's the perfect werewolf-vampire romance. So the party happily and cheerfully brought their new femme fatale vampire baddie back to camp, along with another player character and some much needed medicine too. A few missions later though, the group takes up a task to go to a tree and to do a ritual that the Archphysician tells them to do. Pretty simple, right? Well, no, because I made some mistakes here, and you'll see why. Because there's something that some player characters have been getting over the course of this campaign, called corruption. Whenever they fight the impure, they have a chance to get some corruption. Very Band of Blades-esque, right? Well, this particular tree is guarded by a small spell that zaps you depending on how much corruption you have. The player characters not wanting to get zapped at all sent Varos in, who had absolutely zero corruption on him. He did the ritual at the tree, but found a dead member of Talisman's church. A dead member of the church from a sect that was exiled almost 20 years ago and has went missing. Now, an excommunicated part of the church that was banished from a corrupt church. I thought that would be very interesting, especially because this particular individual was basically standing on a giant puzzle because they had buried something of great importance at this tree. They knew they were never going to be able to escape the impure with the injuries they had, but they still had some important information and items buried there. The player characters heard about this body after Varos returned, after performing a very simple ritual, and basically all said, yeah, we're not doing it, and they went back. The session took about 30 minutes, and we ended it there because they had quote-unquote completed the mission. However, 90% of the mission was solving the puzzle and uncovering the information. It nearly killed me when they did this, but I suppose it was all my fault. I should have remembered one of the golden rules. Players will always try and do the most efficient thing, despite it being the least fun thing. They knew they had a mission to perform the ritual, but none of the players there were the exploratory type, so they just left. Even the player who played Talisman just looked at that and said, not worth it, and left. It is okay though, because they're gonna have to probably come back to this place later, as buried underneath this sacred tree was an item that is central for them to basically find a cure to the impure. Now, I thought after this that things were already a little bit shaky, but the next mission after this, titled Blood Rhyme, is where the Solandis campaign really began to take off. This was a personal mission given to Kelos by Zelona. Again, the player did not know that the Titan Queen is the one pulling the strings behind this, but they simply asked Kelos to bring some friends and to basically perform a blood ritual. Upon going to the site of this blood ritual, the players knew that things were definitely up. One of the reasons they knew this is because the god of sin appeared to be wounded by the site of this ritual. The god of sin said, look, don't go in there, it's a bad idea, and then was vanished, taken away. The player characters at this point, who consisted of Kelos Sky, B, and the deer, along with the NPC Claudia in tow, ignored these warnings and basically went inside a ritual circle and were teleported into one of the domains that Zelona once controlled. After walking across some clouds in the sky, seeing some very strange eldritch markings, and solving a dungeon-wide Legend of Zelda-esque puzzle, they began to head deeper into this sanctum. As they were going deeper inside, they fought a devil who was guarding the door to the end of this dungeon. After slaying the devil, Kelos got a new spear called the Blood Spear, which is one of the weapons that Zelona gifted her most loyal followers. It is basically a focus for Titan power in weapon form. But once again, the players didn't know this and they kept on venturing deeper and deeper into this place. Now I should note, this dungeon didn't look like your average dungeon, it looked like clouds. And as they walked upon these clouds, they found different things upon the clouds. But as they continued deeper and deeper, the sky turned from early morning to noon to dusk, and eventually they reached midnight in the night sky. When they reached midnight, they found this massive brazier and were told to sacrifice their blood into it. Of course, the players sacrificed their blood into the brazier. And then Z offered the chance for the player characters to look at the quote-unquote truth. At this point, I stepped out of game, and I basically told the players, look, I am giving you the chance to look at this, and basically kind of told them, this will affect your character in some way if you choose to look. It will change the character that you're playing, and I think if you're going to be doing these things as a dungeon master, it's important to have that player buy-in. If you're going to be making this change, to give the players out of character this information, this insight into the choice they're making. Because at the end of the day, it is just a game, and you don't want a player to accidentally ruin their own character. That is kinda shitty. Well, no, it just is shitty. Two of the player characters, Kilos and B, and one of the NPCs, Claudia, decided to look. The deer buried their head in the clouds because they did not want to look upon the eldritch truth. What the player characters were then shown is something called the Dark Star. This is the corrupting influence that basically turned the Titans evil long ago. Zelona, actually a servant of the Dark Star, showed these player characters its eldritch truth, and it buried itself into their minds and basically turned them into acolytes of the Dark Star. And I'm not gonna lie, I might have gotten a little dramatic in this moment. Eclipsing joy and serenity with its silent malevolence, its silent symphony, whispering an enthralling yet harrowing tale, a siren's call that invites the intrepid to peer into the abyss, only to spiral into the depths of insanity, their very essence consumed by the unfathomable void it embodies. You both shed a tear along with Claudia, because you've never seen something so beautiful in all your life. Who knows, maybe you guys thought that was a little bit cringe, but I know that the players absolutely loved it. And so after this session, we now have two player characters and an NPC who are working for the Dark Star, planning to spread its corruption and its eldritch truth. While not directly said, they are beginning to try and work to unleash the Dark Star upon the world and to spread its corrupting void light upon everyone and everything, twisting this place into a caricature of itself, kind of like what happened with the Titans. So now we have that on the table, and things only get worse on the next mission. You see, up until this point, the brigade has not actually moved. They still have hundreds of miles to go and many different moves necessary to get to Widowstone Keep, which is their goal. So at this point, with nearly a third of their time gone, they are going to attempt to get one final mission done, rescue some people, and leave. All the previously mentioned characters except Be Good go on this mission. What is the mission, you might be asking? Well, it's a combat mission to stop an approaching force of Impure from sacking a town and its people. They're trying to basically provide this town enough time to leave and head back to their camp. When they were going on this mission, Talisman only had about 2/3 of their health. Talisman's player then took them on this mission. Through a series of awful, no good, very bad decisions, Talisman was killed. And it's bad because they were killed partially because they went into the battle not at full strength, partially because they didn't use cover, they didn't retreat from enemies close to them, they didn't use basically their armor, which would have saved their life. So at the end of this, basically what you and all the players knew was this player character died for no reason. Or rather, they died when they did not have to die. Luckily though, Kilo Sky was on this mission, and she used one of her miracles to revive Talisman. And I allowed it because the player really likes this character. And so Talisman was revived, the town was saved, and then Talisman learned that they were going to have to perform a mission for Z, their new patron, else after 7 days they were going to die. Talisman, the character, did not like this, so they sought other options. First, they went to the exorcist Margot, and Margot said, well, we can perhaps try and anchor what's left of your soul to the body so it doesn't leave. But Margot's not that powerful, so it's unlikely. They then went to one of the Archfey that said, well, I might have a way of saving your life, but basically you're going to constantly need to keep finding sources of energy to power yourself, else you'll die. Your life force will just snuff out. I can't give you a permanent new soul. We're not powerful enough for that. Okay, said Talisman, so they turned to another force. Remember when I talked about Bob at the very start of this little recap? Yeah, well, this is the entity that they went and they summoned and turned to. Something you need to know about this devil. They are incredibly powerful, on the level of an archdevil, like a Azariel, and the regular Forgotten Realms setting in this campaign world. They also are incredibly intelligent and devious when making deals. Whenever I am playing this character, I am at my most deceptive and tricky, because every deal that Bob tries to give is explicitly trying to get despair from the individual. The deals are also not mechanically based. Like, it's not a curse to lower your walking speed, or anything as banal as that. The curses and the deals are more insidious, again, trying to extract as much despair from the individual. Devils in this setting feed off of despair. Bob calls it his meat, his sustenance. Therefore, if you're gonna go and make a deal with a devil, you know that it's probably your last resort. Whatever they are going to offer is probably gonna suck for you. So initially they go to Bob, and Bob demands that they sacrifice a beloved NPC of theirs to the Impure. They just have to leave her out in the woods and basically be taken. That was not an option for Talisman. So then they said, well, I want you to go and get your god to fall to me. You're close to your god, so therefore I think that you can do it. And I want your god to eventually work for me. This also was not viable for Talisman. They didn't want to do it, so they tried to leave. And this is where Bob got him. They said, look, if you leave, I'm going to go to this NPC that loves you. The one that we previously talked about potentially being sacrificed. And he said, look, if you leave, I'm going to go to her. And I'm going to get a deal out of her because she loves you so much. So you can either be the one making the deal, or we can leave you out of this deal entirely. But you came to me, and you're not going to walk away from me. You see, this devil knows what he's doing. And so at this point, they start to negotiate a little bit more. So this is the deal the player made. They did not want to be the only ones suffering from despair. They were willing to have the entire brigade be brought down with them. There are 4 categories of supplies in this West Marches campaign that need to be kept up. These are intelligence, morale, recovery, which is medicine used to heal people, and then just general supplies used to feed the soldiers and the civilians traveling with the brigade. So the deal they ended up on was this. As the brigade moves, Bob would take -5 from their morale score, and then he would take -10 collectively from the other 3 categories. This is a lot of stuff in the campaign. In a grim, dark setting where any supplies are difficult to come across, -15 across the board collectively, well, that's backbreaking. Additionally, Bob got it in writing that if someone tried to stop him, that he could bring all the forces of hell to collect. Basically, if the brigade tried to stop him from taking his tithe, then, legally, through the divine laws, he could bring his devils out and forcefully take what he was owed. But in this setting, everything has to be fair and equitable. A devil couldn't just make a deal of this size, of this caliber, if there wasn't a back door to get out of. And the back door was incredibly simple. If Talisman ever failed to have the brigade give him his tithe, or at any point in the future, Talisman would give over his beloved NPC. And this NPC would then go and work for Bob and become his apprentice. Bob would make this NPC like him, which the player correctly identified as being a terrible fate. Turning their beloved NPC into a devil that was like Bob, yeah, that's a fate worse than death. But at 1 a.m. in a Discord call alone, they struck that deal. And immediately, everybody in the brigade has begun to panic. Now they are low on time and resources. Now in their course of panic and confusion, the brigade does a lot of things and learns a lot of new information, so I'm just going to rapid fire them at you real quick. They learned that the Archfey Cordell actually had a child that she lost into Prez, and so she's been mourning the death of her child. Damien runs about 2 miles ahead of the other people he's with on a particular mission and dies as he is swarmed by monsters. It's okay though, Key and Claudia bring him back as a servant of the Dark Star. The brigade also learns about a strange force called the Zerozixia. They aren't exactly sure what it is, but they know some people are looking for it. Bloom realizes that there is a powerful seal called the Meropian Seal in his head holding back certain memories. This seal can only be created through at least 5 gods working together, so another hint that something's up. The brigade finally moves to their second location, the town of Bayeux, and the mayor of Bayeux, a man by the name of Mace Crane, strong arms the brigade into a position of leadership. He essentially becomes a general. Thomas also finds one of his sons, Philip, on a mission, so it's a very happy reunion for him, although Philip says that he thinks he saw his brother wandering out in the woods at some point. So now Thomas is looking for his other son. Let's see, what else? Oh, that's right. Bloom takes another deal with Bob because the brigade is at this point completely fucked. Bloom's mission is to go hunt down an individual that broke a deal with Bob and punish him. This individual is an archmage who is thousands of years old and was the apprentice of one of the most powerful mages ever in my setting. His name is Varuz and the party teams up with him. Unfortunately, Varuz is not actually a good guy. The party doesn't know this, but he was actually killed by his master because he was dabbling in demonic magic. Varuz is looking for the Zerozixia and other items of power so that he can essentially take over the world. But right now, the brigade considers him an ally, and Bloom breaks a deal with the devil, so that's probably not going to end well for him. More shenanigans continue to ensue with Bloom, though, as they begin to unlock more of Althara's power, and this has explosive results. Then Varos, following the voice inside his head, goes and tries to seek out a knife. This knife is guarded by a powerful angel named Hester, and has links to Titan powers. Of course, Varos, Damien, and some other PCs take it upon themselves to murder an angel in cold blood. This is a divine sin in my setting, and that means all the gods are after them. And I'm sorry I'm going a little bit fast here, but I have to skip over a lot because just layers and layers and layers of bullshit is happening at this point. Kilo, Sky, and the Dark Star continue to grow in power as they nab a few more player characters and have them join their cult. But at this point, they are still in the town of Bayeux. It's been about 21 sessions, and about half their time is gone. The brigade is still hundreds of miles away from their destination of Widowstone Peak, and they are now up against the clock. With the Impure closing in on them, 3 player characters take it upon themselves to find a route through the mountains so that the brigade can escape. These 3 characters are the Deer, Thomas Blythe, and Damien. Now here's something that you need to know about this mission. This is a puzzle mission. The party needs to find this path through the mountains that is guarded by puzzles and gates, riddles, things like that. These players are the exact wrong type of people to be doing these puzzles. They're not good at puzzles. So it's not surprising in hindsight that they halfway complete the mission. They go halfway down the track of getting through the mountains, but they don't actually fully navigate the path. So when the group then decides to move camp, it's not going to go well for them. Especially because they're getting into mass combat at this point. Now the mass combat system I use in this campaign is fairly simple. The enemy's combat strength is decided by a roll of 2d6, plus the pressure that the brigade is under, plus any other additional modifiers that make sense in the moment. The brigade's pressure at this point was plus 15. Well, it's based on the overall health of the brigade, so For every point above 2 in a certain category, that's a point to the brigade's overall roll. For instance, if the brigade has a supplies of 4, that's 2 above 2, which means a +2 to their roll. And here is where Bob really screws them, because before the Bob tax happens, they were going to roll at a +12. Still very respectable, they still had a greater chance of losing, but it could have been close. After the Bob tax, they were rolling +4 against +15. The players who are on this mission then decide to commit the Archfey Canaston into the fight, trying to get them that little extra boost necessary, an extra d6 to try and win the day and not be completely defeated. Long story short, they lose, and one of the Archfey Canaston, in a heart-wrenching sequence, is taken, captured in the fighting, and is turned into one of the Blossomed. The brigade loses almost 500 soldiers out of their 3,000 in this combat as they hastily retreat through the mountain pass. After an absolutely terrible trek through the mountains, they go to the other side to a location called Allstride Camp. Now, Allstride Camp is a refugee camp that has been being run terribly by Talisman's corrupt church. The people there are starving, crime is incredibly high, their defenses aren't even up to snuff. There were already about 20,000 civilians following the brigade, but as they approach Allstride Camp, there's another about 75,000 civilians here. And they are all starving, so the brigade has to give them more supplies just to make sure there isn't a riot. Morale continues to be quite low as the brigade holds a remembrance for the fallen dead in Canaston, and then they partially fail a few more missions. Everything, though, begins to come to a head as the brigade basically corners Talisman and says, "What are you doing? What's going on? Why is there a devil taking our stuff? How can we stop this deal?" After a lot of poking and prodding, they finally get Talisman to say what the deal was, and they summon Bob. Now, the players were talking about potentially renegotiating the deal, but Bob was so terrifying or intimidating, or I'm not sure, in the moment that everyone there just kind of froze when he was summoned. I've never seen, I think it was 8 players completely blue screen that hard. After about a 30-minute conversation, they make no new deals with Bob for information or supplies, and they don't even attempt to renegotiate Talisman's deal. Essentially, I roleplayed the devil holding all the cards for 30 minutes straight, offering potential things that he could have given the party, but at that moment, the players just didn't take any of the hooks. And honestly, you have to be completely okay with that. If the players aren't ready to seize the moment when it happens, then that's on the players. Especially if you, as the game master, aren't actively trying to make it worse for them. As much as we, as game masters, want our players to step up in the quote-unquote right moments, we don't have that control. We have to let the players play their characters out. I thought it was a great interaction, though, and basically confirmed that the Bob tax was here to stay. So now with 2/3 of their time gone, the brigade realizes they need to get their asses in gear. I think the impetus for this change comes when Be Good goes and meets with this new ancient mage, Varuz. They give Varuz their black pyramid, and Varuz immediately knows what this thing is. There is a family of items in my campaign world called the Tetrahedrons. They were created during the last Titan War. Each tetrahedron has a particular specialty. This particular tetrahedron is called the Divider. The NPC wizard who originally found the Divider was taking it to the last Storm Witch so they could devise a way to separate the infecting power of the Impure from regular people and the ring itself. But now that B and the other agents of the Dark Star have the Divider, they are going to attempt to divide the chains that hold back the Dark Star and bring it into the world. So you have pro-Titan forces and anti-Titan forces that both want the Divider. But Varuz represents the demons, this force of chaos that is currently not in the campaign world. You see, I've been adamant with my players for years that demons do not exist in my world, or at least they are not there right now. Whenever a demon is seen, which has only been once so far in a campaign finale, it has been a big deal. So now we have a dark wizard like Varuz who's trying to take the power of the Divider, use it to basically bring about an age of demons, and fill himself with demonic power and energy, all while on the outside seeming like a generally good guy. If any of you have ever read the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, spoiler alert, this is kind of like what Baez is. Even the name Varuz is a subtle nod to that series. I really like the character of Baez, and I thought his role in the First Law trilogy is something that I could use for a campaign antagonist in my own world. Now, I don't believe Varuz's plan is going to come to fruition anytime soon, probably not in this campaign. But this is how I begin to build world arcs. You begin to seed the next antagonist for the next campaign, the campaign you're running now. Maybe they die, maybe he's going to be beaten, maybe he's not a future or long-term antagonist. But here's the thing, I'm the game master, I'm running the world, I can seed as many future antagonists as I want. More likely than not, at least one of them is going to survive. And because I'm a good game master, my games 99% of the time finish when they start, I know I'm going to have a next campaign to tell the story of Varuz or the Banker of Bones or whoever the antagonist is going to be. But let's get back to Solandis for a moment, because Varuz went, saw the Divider, and basically ran off with it. The player characters tried to get the Divider back in the middle of the night, and Bloom openly told Varuz, "Yeah, Bob told me to come and basically assassinate you." So our favorite Dark Wizard wasn't really keen on sticking around the camp. Instead, he took his flying sphere, which he travels around in, and went to a previous mission location so that he could begin trying to do a ritual to learn more information about the Divider. A squad of heroes that included Andreas, B, Key, and Bloom went and followed Varuz to this location. After being cornered, Varuz basically sweet-talked his way out of combat with this group. He showed how useful he was being to the rest of the party, and basically gave the analogy that if you saw a small child about to touch a hot stove, you wouldn't let the child touch the hot stove, you would want to keep those children safe, essentially comparing the brigade to children. Now, in maybe another situation, the players would have objected, but they had really been shitting the bed as of late, so they could understand why this powerful NPC didn't necessarily want to give them this powerful item back. He talked to B and Key how he could help them unravel the mysteries of this item and maybe focus its power more. He talked to Bloom about how he could help with the Meropian seal so that they could carefully explore the visions that Bloom had been having of late. And then he talked to Andreas because for the past few sessions that the Andreas character had played, he's been able to start summoning force fields. The player didn't know why that was happening, but Varuz began to run tests on Andreas's blood and basically came to a few conclusions. The first is that Andreas had a lot of latent magical energy within him, and the second is that he wasn't abiding by the regular rules of magic in this campaign world, because usually the people who use magic in this campaign world have to channel it from a certain plane. I'll put it in the context of the Forgotten Realms campaign world, so I don't have to explain a lot of backstory to you guys right now. Essentially, if you are a mage, then you would draw your magic, let's say, from the elemental plane of fire. If you're drawing magic from the elemental plane of fire, maybe you're more bent towards destruction magic, or your magic is very caustic and explosive. And it would be quite different if you were drawing upon the elemental plane of water, for instance. And you can draw from essentially any plane of existence. You can draw your magic from the Feywild, you can draw it from the Shadowfell, draw it from the negative energy plane, or maybe even the Abyss. You can tell a lot about a spellcaster in this campaign world from where they're drawing their energy from. And the magic that Andreas' character is drawing from is not from any plane. He's drawing all of his energy from himself. You see, Andreas has the potential to manifest the Zero Zixia, which is essentially kind of like a power source that is stored in the collective consciousness of all people on the particular plane that they're in. It's kind of like the Chosen One trope, but not really. It's part of, again, another magic system in this campaign world. I'm trying not to overload you with campaign lore. What you have to know is there's a high likelihood that Andreas' magic is being drawn from the same source as the Zerozixia. Varuz doesn't come out here and say this, but the player out of game I think very much knows it's a possibility. I'm already prepared to throw in some twists and red herrings to draw him away from that outcome, but Varuz certainly believes that this guy has the potential to become very strong, and then once he's manifested the Zerozixia and he has the Divider at full power, he's going to use both things to essentially become a demon himself, and with all this demonic energy, he's gonna, again, take over the world. But at this point, all the player characters think that Varuz is indispensable, and they kind of forgive him. Varuz has detected a temple close by with a focus for the Divider. This is something that they can essentially use to harness the energy of this very powerful item. The party agrees to go to this temple at a place called Hanarnas Peak. Now translated, Hanarnas is midnight, so midnight peak. I always kind of like to subtly hint at locations and their importance, where if players are paying attention or are thinking about the name or translating the name, it basically tells them what a particular location is about. So for some of my players that speak Welsh, they can translate it as, alright, he's saying midnight peak. Midnight, that connects likely to the Dark Star. This is a location built around the Dark Star and the Titans. And this was absolutely right. I got to drop some lore as they go inside this temple, solve a few puzzles, get spooked and scared a little bit, but they eventually get a scepter in which the Divider, this small little pyramid, could be placed on, and the power within it harnessed. And all the while, I'm hinting to the players about parts of their backstory. I'm hinting how Bloom is likely Althara or connected to the Titans in some way. I'm hinting to Kelos and B that their power is likely derived from the Titans, or they're probably working in some way with an entity connected to the Titans. And then, via the power of Andreas' force shields and how the creatures inside this temple don't like the power, hinting that whatever power he's got, it's far more powerful than he originally expected. So the mission wraps up with the Brigade and Varuz getting the Divider and the focusing scepter of the Divider. Varuz is in a powerful spot, and he's still looking for ingredients and pieces of this ritual so that he can bring forth his demonic power. But the last mission that was gone on was spearheaded by Talisman, as for the first time he really got to interact with the corruption within his church. Talisman, Thomas, Bloom, and a few other PCs went to the Church of Corania, Talisman's church, and they got to meet with some of the higher-ups in the church and quickly got to realize that these people did not care about the civilians. The Church of Corania, at least this branch, is corrupt all the way down. And it is so corrupt because an antagonist that I seeded many other campaigns ago has thus far taken a prominent role within the church. This antagonist is trying to turn the church against the people and essentially weaken the world for the oncoming of the Titan invasion. And this is because the Church of Corania is basically a church of civil engineers. Their god, Corania, is built around the construction of civilization. She values scientists, architects, engineers, and anybody else who can go and build up the societal welfare of a place. She is basically a city builder. Her favorite game is SimCity. So if you were wanting to destroy those things, one of the best things you could do is go to the people that are trying to build up that infrastructure and have them essentially do the opposite. Now, begrudgingly, the party is sent on a mission from the Church of Corania to take down these rebels. Quickly, they realize that these quote-unquote rebels are people that the church tried to take advantage of. The church had been trying to steal the medicine that they were hoarding for their sick. So these people stole the medicine back with the help of the exiled branch of the church and escaped into the wilderness. After some really intense negotiation, the party decides to help these people out. They'll allow them to keep their medicine and they'll give them some additional supplies, some additional medicine. This will help these people and their sick make the trek to the exiled group's camp, basically their fortress, and in exchange, they let the party go with a special medallion that they use to trick the church, and basically, the church now thinks that the Brigade are loyal followers of them. But really, the biggest thing they got was a map that Talisman and the others can follow to the site of this exiled part of the church. So now the player who plays Talisman has a choice: go along with this corrupt church, or, which I think is the choice they're going to go with, go and track down the exiled sect of their church, learn the true secrets of how this church is so corrupt, and begin trying to fix the organization. At least I really hope this is the direction they go, because the exiled members of the church know a lot more about the Titan corruption that's been happening. So at this point, at the very least, the brigade has some hope. They're at 20 out of 30 time, they have 7 intelligence, 8 morale, 3 supplies, and 2 recovery. So they're not doing all that bad. They have enough morale and supplies to cover the Bob tax if they move, and they have a few avenues of bettering themselves as they go. Additionally, they just uncovered a boss quest with the intelligence they've spent. The boss is known as the Choir and is basically this amalgam of flesh created by one of the Blossomed. This is going to be a massive challenge for the group, and they all know this, but fighting infamous bosses like this is one of the few ways in this West Marches campaign thus far that they can decrease the amount of pressure on the brigade and decrease the amount of time that has been accumulated. Or would I say increase the amount of time they have left? I don't know, English is hard. But all the players are beginning to band together to take out this infamous boss. So overall, I'd put the health of this campaign at a good 7 or 8 out of 10. The players are talking about the campaign with each other, out of game with each other. They're making plans, they're making fan art, playlists. They have a lot of investment. Overall, the situation in which their characters are in could probably be going a little bit better. But the night is darkest before the dawn, and one of the most important things that I did in Session 0 was say, this is going to be a tougher campaign. Your backs are probably going to be against the wall. And because I couched the players' expectations about what this campaign was going to be, they're ready for the challenges ahead. Now, one of the things I'm keeping in mind is I want to start to ideally have that pressure be lessened on them a bit. They are under a lot of pressure right now, and I don't want it to be sustained for much longer. So ideally, when I next update you guys, my goal is to make it so the players in this campaign feel about half the amount of pressure that they do now. There's not an objective way to measure this, but I think I'll be able to tell in their mood, in their actions, tone of voice, etc. Also, before any of you ask if you've gotten this far in the video, no, I will not be streaming this game. Why won't I be streaming this game? Because people on the internet are mean. The amount of hate that I sustain on a daily basis, even as a very small YouTuber, is more than I would like to subject my friends to. They don't deserve the kind of hate they would get, and while it might be entertaining, I don't think it will be. Plus, I think that we would just pump out content way too fast for the average viewer, and it really just wouldn't be a good watching experience at all. I think a happy medium is to just update loyal viewers at the end of these Q&A videos if you're interested. So if you want to be updated on what happens with this West Marches campaign, if the players are able to overcome the Choir, and if they're able to get to Widowstone Peak, check out the next video in this series. But until then, check out this video right here. I answer more great questions from you guys. Don't worry, it's much shorter than this video. And thank you for entering the dungeon.